Good afternoon, my friends. This is the Grim Flayer. Hope you're all doing very well today, and we are here to talk about the newest spoiler that I think can rock. It is Shadowspear. It is a legendary piece of equipment, and my perspective is that this card is a playable one of somewhere in the 75 of the modern BGX archetype. It can rock, it can jund, it can sultai, and perhaps most of all, it can be a part of Abzan Stoneblade because, of course, it can be tutored for by Stoneforge Mystic. However, I do not think that is necessary to enable or facilitate the presence of this card in your BGX deck. I think it does enough on its own, and I think it's kind of gone under the radar for some. I do believe I was the very first one on the hype train for this card, if the Discord is anything to go by, so this is kind of my sticking my neck out here. I think a lot of other people have already started to agree, but certainly there's a lot of skepticism on it here, and who knows, as always, my friends, I could well be wrong, but I think this card is playable, and I'm going to make a case as to why. So thank you so much to all Patreon supporters who make this content possible. Let's talk about Shadowspear in Modern. Alright guys, we've got a generic casting cost of 1. We like that, it's nice and cheap, very hard castable. You don't even get to cheat on mono with Stoneforge Mystic, which is one of the reasons I don't think this is confined to a Stoneblade shell. This is also very nice to flip off of Dark Confidant because it is a mana sink that you're getting more than 1 mana's worth of value out of, but you're only paying 1 life for it. Also, of course, just very nice because it's got 2 different activated abilities, so sometimes you can just play it turn 1 if it's your best player, if you don't have a better play, or sometimes it enables you to double spell on turn 3, or it enables you on turn 4 or 5 to play it and have, you know, all kinds of options open to you. So the fact that it's got a raw casting cost of 1, very, very nice. It is a legendary, which is one of many reasons I think it's probably best left as a one of, and it's obviously an artifact. So what does it do? Well, equipped creature gets +1/+1 and has trample and lifelink, and it also has an equip cost of 2, so we're jumping from the first line to the third line there, but of course those two are linked. Whenever you see equipped creature does something, you want to know how much it costs to equip. So, one reason equipment has historically been unplayable in Modern is that the tempo blowout can be too big. If you're trying to play a very powerful weapon like Sword of Fire and Ice, you invest 3 mana into playing it, and then another 2 to equip it, you have lost 5 mana if your opponent responds with like a 1 mana or 2 mana kill spell on your target, on your desired sword bearer. Then you have just gotten blown out on the tempo axis. But the fact that Shadowspear is only 1 to cost, only 3 total mana invested if you're trying to equip it, and does another thing, a nearly totally unrelated thing on top of that, means that we are not running the normal risks of that equipment usually brings to the table, and therefore I really like what it does. But what's the second thing it does? Well, permanents your opponent's control, Luke's hexproof and indestructible until end of turn. That is an activated ability for 1 generic mana. So this, in short, is going to significantly buff a creature that wears it, especially if it has high natural stats. Now, do you know any card that sees play in BGX decks and Modern that is just kind of a big dumb beater? I think it rhymes with Harmaboyf. You know, the name escapes me, but I'm pretty sure we play a big green fatty for 2 mana that would carry Shadowspear very, very well. Look, the stat boost, it's moderate, it's conservative, mild stat boost, but it is relevant, and it's granting the keywords trample and lifelink. Again, this is obviously great on Goyf, but look, this plays on any single one of our threats, especially because trample and lifelink are not keywords that we have access to if you look at the normal BGX creature suite. So this is giving our onboard presence a very different dimension. And then, what's the other thing we do besides turn oversized undercosted creature sideways to win the game? Well, we interact heavily. We rip the opponent's hand apart, yes, but we also spend even more time and even more cards in our 75 killing everything that moves on the board. You can't kill things, though, with targeted removal if they're hexproof, and you can't kill things unless you're splashing white for Path to Exile, for the most part, that have Indestructible. So these two keywords, hexproof and Indestructible, are the bane of our existence on BGX, and with for merely 1 generic mana, 2 total mana invested, 1 to play it, 1 to activate it. This can even be broken up over 2 turns if that's what your sequencing demands, is going to remove all instances of hexproof and indestructible from all permanents your opponents control until the end of the turn. That's a pretty powerful ability, guys. We don't have anything quite like this that also has such a high floor in terms of what else it brings to the table. Again, the equipment mode is kind of surprisingly awesome, I think, on paper in our deck. More so, like, I think we're probably kind of inclined to dismiss that a little bit. I don't think we should. Again, the stat boost and the trample and the lifelink, 1 mana to play, 2 to equip, that's actually pretty seriously decent. Just in a vacuum in the context of our deck, you know, not talking about the meta we're facing. And then the fact that for 1 mana, 1 generic mana activated ability, you're completely routing around hexproof and indestructible, all cases of it for a turn, that's pretty awesome. So the card feels really cool to me. It feels like a really old school design, specifically this 1 mana, 1 generic mana, instant speed activated ability, no other restrictions. It is repeatable. You don't have to tap the artifact. It's not limit 1 per turn, whatever. That just feels like such old school design. I love it. The only thing that would make this more old school is if they printed an alternate version with the old brown border. If you're listening, Wizards, you gotta make that happen in some kind of supplemental set down the line. It would be very, very cool. But yeah, that's what the card does. So it is kind of an interesting proposition in and of itself. Just to resume the talk here, the fact that it is repeatable is a corner case thing, but it can certainly come up. If your opponent has multiple protection spells, for example, if you have the mana open, you can beat multiple protection spells with this. But basically, in a normal use case scenario, we are going to be able to kill an infect creature without them being able to protect it with a protection spell. We are going to be able to kill things that we otherwise could not even target just by spending 1 extra mana for something that is hexproof, and that is going to open up a lot of avenues. But in terms, so that's what the card does, but in terms of how it fits into our deck and how it lines up against the broader meta, let's get into that next. Alright guys, so rather than try to restate what I already wrote, I'm going to show you the post I wrote basically as soon as this was posted on the Modern Magic subreddit, and I'm not just going to read it, you could read it on your own. I'm going to offer further commentary as we go through it. But I write, I think there's a surprisingly compelling case to be made for this card in a BGX shell as a sideboard one of. Honestly, this might even be main deckable too, might depend on your local meta. That will also depend on whether or not the floor of the card, like how the floor of the card ends up being. I expect it to be decent, like just if the hexproof removal, the indestructible removal doesn't matter, then what the floor of the card is going to look like overall, I expect it to be decent, but where in that range of decent it falls falls into, whatever, I can't talk right now, that is going to determine how main deckable it is. That and your local meta, if you have one, or if you don't, the broad meta, the broad trends online and at big events. I go on to say we care a whole lot about killing things, and this card facilitates that nicely against Bogles, Lotus Field, Hazaret, some troublesome spirits like Drogskull Captain, Rattlechains, and Selfless Spirit, and more. It beats protection spells like Blossoming Defense out of Infect. It also forces your interaction through Veil of Summer. That is huge, and just, it doesn't totally blow out Veil because, number one, note that this is only your permanents your opponents control. Your opponents themselves still get hexproof, so unfortunately you cannot force discard through Veil of Summer, or through anything else for that matter with this. And also, Veil of Summer's controller will still get to cantrip. You don't totally blow it out. But look, this is better than any other thing, any other way to fight through a Veil of Summer. Our interaction against their board, our Abrupt Decay on their Oko, our Fatal Push on their Urza, whatever. This will still resolve if we have the Spear forcing it through. So, worth pointing out that none of these things here, besides Veil of Summer and besides maybe Infect, are tier 1. But they're all real decks. Bogles is a real deck, Lotus Field Combo is a real deck, and a real annoying deck. Hazoret sees play in a variety of decks that want a big red threat, whether it be Prison or maybe Sideboard in some more mid-rangey style decks, and Spirits is of course a real deck too. So, in terms of what Shadowspear's activated ability, not the equip ability, the activation, directly hoses, it doesn't directly hose Veil of Summer, but it allows us to trade through it instead of getting blown out by it, more at parity. And the rest of what it hoses is mostly tier 2 or tier 3 established decks, but ones that are not at the very top of the meta right now. That said, this also is going to future-proof us against any possible top-tier decks employing Hexproof or Indestructible in a very important way, because remember, guys, we cannot really afford to ignore their Hexproof or Indestructible payoff. Like, on Mono-Red Prowess, I can't beat Hexproof or Indestructible stuff either, but I can just ignore it and try to race. That's not really an option on the Rock, that's not really an option on BGX in general most of the time. We kind of live and die based on how well we can answer what the opponent does. So having this around in your maybe board, very, very cool. And before I forget, I'll just mention this now too. This isn't an MTG finance channel, you know, I'm not really into that. This is not financial advice, but I think this is going to be a good, just one of to own to have around in your maybe board. For reasons I just mentioned, future-proofing, I think it's also viable now too, and seems like it'll be a high-demand commander card, right? So I don't think you can really go wrong picking one up at a reasonable price. But anyway, back to the post, back to the analysis. Here's a downside, I say, even so. It's a telegraph play that requires open mana and can be answered, so I'm not trying to oversell it. To expand, this is kind of the blessing and the curse of Shadowspear. If it was a purely reactive card or like just an instant style effect, we would have the element of surprise, we would have a higher blowout potential, but we would have a lower floor because there would be times where we're not being proactive so we can hold up that card. Here, the fact that you can just play it for one and then it's out there, you've already, half the mana you need to invest has already been invested. This gives it a higher floor, and of course it's a much, much higher floor than a purely reactive card to beat Hexproof and Indestructible, because it does other things too. It makes our clock and our ability to race way better. So that said, it is telegraphed like I write here. It does require you to sometimes sequence in a suboptimal way to leave the mana open, and it can be answered if they have an ability to answer it. So bear that in mind, bear those downsides in mind. But let's also acknowledge that a slight stat buff alongside Lifelink and Trample, two notoriously absent abilities in the typical BGX threat suite, is a pretty reasonable thing to do when you're trading resources. So to explain that a little bit more, another reason that people historically haven't made equipment work in Modern is because you can't just, like, tap out for a creature, then tap out for an equipment, then tap out or mostly tap out to equipment, or to equip the creature, and then hope that you're magically just going to connect and your opponent's not really doing anything and you're going to snowball all these advantages. But we interact so heavily, we're taking removal spells out of their hand, we're killing their board presence, we're otherwise disrupting their plan, that we, you know, more realistically can take the game long and can throw the opponent off their plan enough to the point where we can realistically equip and connect with a creature plus this item. Tarmogoyf carries this very well, and it helps shore up red deck wins and other hyper aggro matchups without dedicating a slot solely to these decks. I would like to really, really emphasize this. If you take one thing away, maybe it should be this from the kind of the deeper analysis of this post. If you play the Rock like I do, you have 7 bad cards against burn if you're on a list like mine. You've got 4 Dark Confidants, 3 Thought Seizes, These are some of the strengths of the archetype. We can leverage these cards better than other BGX decks because our mana is relatively painless, but we also need to get them out against burn. We need to get them mostly out against a lot of other hyper-aggressive decks, but at the same time, it is pretty much impossible right now, especially, to dedicate really narrow hate cards to those red deck wins matchups. Like, you can play a Collective Brutality or two, because that does double duty against Control and Collected Company in small creature decks. You can play a Kitchen Finks maybe because it's good against Jund and against Shadow and decent against Supreme Verdict decks as well. But you can't really afford a Life Goes On. You can't really afford a narrow card that hoses burn but doesn't really do anything else unless your local meta is infested. So the fact that this card, imagine guys how good this card is going to be against burn. I don't think burn is realistically beating this card if it's part of our normal decent progression against like a normal decent progression of theirs that otherwise might be a really close game. I think Shadowspear just blatantly swings the matchup in our favor, and I think it is a perfectly reasonable card to bring in against other linear aggressive decks, even against the tribal decks like humans. I don't know. I'm certainly willing to give it a shot. I think it's going to really allow us to race them incredibly well against decks that clog up the ground. It's going to perhaps permit us to break through a board stall more effectively than we otherwise would. Certainly, again, with specifically Tarmogoyf, big problem with Goyf is it can get chumped for days. Trample gets around that. Lifelink, very good with Trample and very good with the natural big stats. The stats get even bigger with Shadowspear. I think this is a very significant reason why I like this card. Again, the fact that it naturally shores up these hyper aggro matchups without necessarily being there to even do that, right? Finally, to finish this post, it can be tutored by SFM if you're an Absent, as we said. There's a lot going on here, and the mere structure of the card greatly alleviates its own inherent weaknesses. I think this is also pretty important. So, static hate pieces, think like Pithing Needle, are typically not ideal in mid-range decks because they don't advance your clock, and that lack of proactivity gives your opponent a chance to draw out of your disruption. But Shadowspear is proactive as long as you have a creature down. So this is a static hate piece against spirits, against Lotus Field, against Bogles, against all that other stuff. It's a static hate piece that really can disrupt their plan significantly, but that's not all it does. We're not kind of like sacrificing our clock to do this. This makes our clock better, and it swings the race really heavily in our favor, especially against Bogles. Like, we can get out of their range with lifelink pretty well if we're also able to kill their stuff, obviously. So that's what I mean by that. And then the opposite also applies. So this kind of touches on what I already said, but equipment is notoriously unplayable in Modern due to its conditional nature and the risk of tempo blowouts. So again, you need a creature to stick, you need a creature to survive, you need to be able to connect, you're risking getting tempo blown out, but Shadowspear is a way to facilitate interaction first and a piece of equipment second, at least some of the time, and it's also cheap to cast, so we reduce the risk of major tempo loss in the race, that should be face, in the face of opposing interaction. So again, like, the natural weaknesses of equipment are kind of alleviated because this isn't just equipment, it's also a route around for some very problematic keywords for us. And the natural weaknesses of static hate pieces in a mid-range deck is alleviated because this is a way to be proactive and to advance our beatdown plan. You look at how cards like Plague Engineer and Collector Oof are so great for us because they hate out the opponent, they can X for 1 the opponent, and they can turn sideways to help end the game. Shadowspear is a little bit more conditional in how it does that, but it still follows the same type of logic. So, I conclude the post by saying, will it rock? Maybe, maybe not, but it is worth taking note of this card, IMO, and that is how we are going to conclude this video, my friends. That is my take on Shadowspear. Again, I think it does a lot. I think we should not dismiss the floor on this card, and we should not dismiss the ceiling on it, because we need to be able to interact with everything our opponent's doing. We can't usually interact with Hexproof or Indestructible until now, in a way that otherwise makes sense. Like, there's cards like, whatever it is, Detection Tower, I think it's a colorless land that can take away this stuff until end of turn. This is a better way to do it. This is a way with much more proactivity baked into the pie and much wider applications as well. So there you go, my friends. Shadowspear, I think it will rock. I don't think it's mandatory. So I think it's a fine one of, if you feel that this is not the most efficient use of your slot, you feel you need other things in the meta right now, I get it. But at the same time, remember, this gives you outs to a lot of stuff we cannot otherwise usually beat. And it also is going to really shore up those hyper aggro matchups kind of incidentally. And the fact that it's got such good synergy with Tarmogoyf and with the rest of our threat suite to a lesser extent means that it might even just be main deckable. I don't know. This needs testing, but I think it's promising. I think you're going to be doing yourself a disservice if you dismiss it out of hand. And I am not just saying that about every card to hedge my bets. I haven't even made videos addressing the other cards like Clothis. I don't think that's going to Jund. I don't even think it's worth addressing. I think it's that far away from Junding. But this, I think, is in real contention. So anyway, guys, you know that I would love to hear from you. And that's what the comment section is for. So let it rip in the comments. Let me know what you think about it. And let me know if there's anything else that you think is worth considering in evaluating this card, pro or con. Thank you so much for watching, my friends. Stay tuned, because when this new set comes out, we're jamming Kroxa, the new Titan, and Jund. We're going to jam Shadowspear and Rock, and even before that, we're going to jam some Seasons Past and Pioneer and some modern Plague Rock just for you. So thank you again for watching, and I will talk to you soon. I hope everybody out there has a wonderful day.